Blackwells Shifting Sands. New York, 1919. The war was over. Catherine Montgomery had boarded the RMS Mauritania, bound for America, believing she had left the past behind. But on the second night, she found herself face to face with Sergeant Lucas Beckett, a man she had once loved, a man who had died in battle. He smiled at her from across the deck. "Catherine," he murmured, "I was afraid I'd never find you." Chapter 1. The Ghost of Southampton Docks. The fog hung heavy, a spectral shroud clinging to the Southampton docks. It muffled the cacophony of farewells, the cries of gulls, the mournful groan of the RMS Mauritania preparing to sever its ties with England. Catherine Montgomery pulled her coat tighter, the damp chill seeping into her bones, a mirror of the coldness that had settled in her heart since the telegram. Since the war had stolen everything. She glanced back at the receding shore, a blur of gray and fading lights. Leaving England felt like exhaling a breath held for too long, a painful release. She was leaving behind the ghosts, the memories that clung to every cobblestone street, every rain-washed windowpane. Leaving behind the woman she had been, a nurse hardened by the relentless tide of wounded, the endless nights punctuated by screams, and the metallic tang of blood. Leaving behind him, "Ticket, madam?" The steward's voice was polite, but his eyes held the weary indifference of a man who had seen too much, felt too little. Catherine fumbled in her handbag, her fingers brushing against the worn leather of her wallet, the sharp corner of a photograph frame tucked inside. She didn't need to look at it. She knew every line, every shadow of the image imprinted on her memory. Lucas, smiling, his eyes crinkling at the corners, his hand resting on the rough bark of an oak tree, a fleeting moment of peace captured before the world had shattered. Sergeant Lucas Beckett. Officially declared killed in action, Chateau Thierry, 1918. She presented her ticket, a small, rectangular piece of paper that represented her passage to a new life, a life she wasn't sure she deserved. America. A land of promise, of reinvention. A land where, perhaps, she could outrun the grief that dogged her steps. The Mauritania was a floating palace, a testament to a gilded age that felt a lifetime ago. The opulence was almost obscene, a stark contrast to the austerity she had grown accustomed to. Crystal chandeliers glittered, casting prisms of light on the polished mahogany panels. Plush velvet seating invited weary travelers to sink into its embrace. But Catherine found no comfort in it. The extravagance felt hollow, a gilded cage carrying her further and further away from the only thing that had ever felt real. She found her cabin, a small but comfortable space with a porthole offering a sliver of a view of the darkening sea. She unpacked mechanically, hanging her few dresses in the wardrobe, placing her toiletries on the small vanity. Her movements were precise, economical, the habits of a nurse who had learned to conserve energy, to find order in chaos. But the chaos within her refused to be contained. It swirled, a tempest of grief and guilt, and a gnawing sense of incompleteness. She had mourned Lucas. She had wept until her eyes were swollen shut, until her throat was raw. She had accepted his death, the cruel finality of it. And yet a knock on the door startled her. It was a young steward, a boy barely old enough to shave, his face pale and drawn. "Madam," he said, his voice trembling slightly, there's a gentleman asking for you." On the promenade deck. Catherine frowned. "A gentleman? I don't know anyone on board." The boy shifted nervously. He insisted. He said it was urgent. He mentioned Chateau Thierry. The blood drained from Catherine's face.
Chateau Thierry.
The name was a shard of glass piercing her heart. It was a cruel joke, a phantom echo of a past she was desperately trying to bury. "I'll be there shortly," she managed to say, her voice barely a whisper. She changed quickly, slipping into a simple, dark blue dress, her fingers fumbling with the buttons. Her reflection in the mirror was a stranger, a pale, haunted woman with eyes that held the weight of unshed tears. The promenade deck was shrouded in the same persistent fog, the air thick with the scent of salt and coal smoke. The distant thrum of the engines vibrated beneath her feet, a constant reminder of the relentless journey, the irreversible passage of time. She walked slowly, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She scanned the shadowy figures huddled in small groups, their faces obscured by the swirling mist. And then she saw him. He was leaning against the railing, his silhouette outlined against the faint glow of the ship's lights. He was taller than she remembered, broader in the shoulders. But the way he held himself, the slight tilt of his head, the way his hand rested on the railing, it was unmistakably him. He turned, and the fog seemed to part, revealing his face. It was Lucas. Older, perhaps, etched with lines of hardship, a faint scar tracing a path across his left cheekbone. But it was him. His eyes, the same intense blue that had always held her captive, met hers. He smiled, a slow, hesitant smile that reached his eyes, crinkling the corners, just like in the photograph. "Catherine," he murmured, his voice a low rumble that resonated deep within her. "I was afraid I'd never find you." The world tilted on its axis. The sound of the waves crashing against the hull faded into a distant hum. The fog swirled around them, a cocoon isolating them from the rest of the world. He was alive. Lucas was alive. But how? And why had he let her believe he was dead? 1,000 questions, 1,000 accusations, 1,000 unspoken emotions surged within her, threatening to overwhelm her. But all she could do was stare, her mind struggling to reconcile the impossible reality before her with the year of grief she had endured. The carefully constructed walls around her heart, built stone by agonizing stone, began to crumble. Chapter 2. Across the empty ballroom, the silence stretched, taut and fragile, punctuated only by the rhythmic creak of the ship and the distant cry of a seagull. Catherine felt a tremor run through her, a wave of dizziness threatening to send her to her knees. Her hand, instinctively, reached out to the railing for support, her knuckles bone-white. "Lucas," she whispered, the name a fragile breath, a question, an accusation, a prayer. It felt foreign on her tongue, a word she had relegated to the realm of memory, of dreams, of heartbreaking what-ifs. He took a step closer, his hand reaching out as if to touch her, then hesitating, hovering in the air between them. The gesture spoke volumes of uncertainty, of fear, of a chasm that had opened between them, a chasm carved by time and death, and a lie she couldn't yet comprehend. "I know," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "I know I have a lot to explain." His eyes searched hers, pleading for understanding, for a forgiveness he hadn't yet earned. They were the same eyes, the same intense blue that had captivated her in the dappled sunlight of a French forest a lifetime ago. But now, they held shadows, depths she hadn't seen before, a weariness that mirrored her own. Catherine forced herself to meet his gaze, her own emotions a turbulent mix of disbelief, anger, and a terrifying, fragile hope that threatened to shatter her composure. "Explain?" she echoed, her voice sharper than she intended. "You let me believe you were dead. You let me mourn you. For a year, Lucas, I carried the weight of your death." Her voice cracked, the carefully constructed dam of her grief threatening to burst. He flinched, as if her words were physical blows. "I had no choice, Catherine. There were circumstances. Things you couldn't know." "Circumstances?" The word tasted like ash in her mouth. What circumstances could possibly justify this? What could possibly justify letting me suffer like that? He looked away, his gaze fixed on the churning gray sea. "It was a matter of national security. My mission, it wasn't over when they thought it was. I was captured, held prisoner. There was no way to contact you, to let you know I was alive." His explanation felt flimsy, inadequate. It raised more questions than it answered. Captured? Held prisoner? By whom? And for what purpose? The war was over. The armistice had been signed. Why would he still be in danger? "The war is over, Lucas," she said, her voice cold, a shield against the overwhelming emotions threatening to consume her. "Why are you here? Why now?" He turned back to her, his eyes filled with a pain that mirrored her own. "Because I couldn't stay away any longer. Because I had to see you, to make sure you were all right. Because I love you, Catherine. I never stopped loving you." The words, spoken with such raw intensity, should have melted the ice around her heart. But they didn't. They couldn't. Not yet. Too much had happened. Too much had been left unsaid. "Love," she scoffed, a bitter laugh escaping her lips. "Love doesn't lie, Lucas. Love doesn't disappear for a year and then reappear on a ship bound for America as if nothing happened." "I know it seems that way," he said, his voice pleading. "But please, Catherine, give me a chance to explain. Let me tell you everything." She hesitated, her mind a battlefield of conflicting emotions. Part of her wanted to run, to escape the overwhelming reality of his presence, to retreat back into the safe, numb world of her grief. But another part, a stubborn, defiant part that refused to be extinguished, wanted to hear his explanation, to understand the truth, however painful it might be. "The ballroom," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's empty this time of night. We can talk there." The ballroom was a vast, cavernous space, its grandeur diminished by the dim lighting and the absence of music and laughter. The polished dance floor reflected the faint glow of the chandeliers, creating an illusion of endless space, of emptiness. It was a fitting backdrop for their reunion, a reflection of the void that had separated them. They sat on opposite ends of a long, velvet-covered bench, the distance between them a physical manifestation of the emotional chasm that had opened between them. The silence returned, heavy and oppressive, filled with unspoken questions, unacknowledged fears, and the ghost of a love that had been shattered by the war and resurrected in the most unexpected of circumstances. The faint scent of lilies, from a vase long since emptied of fresh flowers, hung in the air, a bittersweet reminder of happier times, of dances shared, of promises whispered in the shadows. Catherine stared at the empty dance floor, her mind replaying a memory Lucas, in his uniform, holding her close, guiding her through a waltz, their eyes locked, their hearts beating in time with the music. A tear traced a path down her cheek, a testament to the love she had thought lost, a love that was now a confusing, painful reality. She didn't know if she could trust him, if she could ever forgive him. But she knew she had to listen. She had to hear his story. Chapter 3. The Serpent in Her Cabin. Lucas began his story hesitantly, his voice low and strained, as if each word was a physical effort. He spoke of the chaos of Chateau Thierry, the relentless shelling, the desperate fighting in the trenches. He described his unit, the men he had fought alongside, the camaraderie forged in the crucible of war. And then he spoke of the mission, the one that had led to his supposed death. It was a reconnaissance mission, he explained, his gaze fixed on a point somewhere beyond Catherine's shoulder. "We were sent to gather intelligence on German troop movements, to identify a potential weak point in their lines. It was supposed to be a quick in-and-out operation. But we were ambushed." He paused, his jaw clenching, his knuckles white as he gripped the edge of the bench. Catherine watched him, her heart aching with a mixture of sympathy and suspicion. She had seen the horrors of war firsthand, had tended to the broken bodies, the shattered minds. She knew the toll it took, the scars it left, both visible and invisible. "Most of my unit was killed," he continued, his voice barely a whisper. "I was captured, taken prisoner by a German intelligence officer, a man named von Riker. He was ruthless. He knew things, Catherine, things he shouldn't have known. He had informants, spies everywhere, even within our own ranks." The revelation sent a chill down Catherine's spine. Spies. Betrayal. The words echoed the whispers she had heard in the hospitals, the rumors of double agents, of secret codes, of information bought and sold in the shadows. "Von Riker believed I had information he wanted," Lucas said. "Information about a planned Allied offensive. He interrogated me. For weeks. He used methods that he trailed off, unable to finish the sentence." Catherine could imagine the horrors he had endured, the physical and psychological torture inflicted upon him. She had seen the aftermath of such brutality, the vacant stares, the trembling limbs, the minds broken beyond repair. But I didn't break, he said, his voice gaining strength, a flicker of defiance in his eyes. I didn't tell him anything. I knew that if I did, it would cost the lives of thousands of our men. A surge of respect, of admiration, washed over Catherine. Despite her anger, her confusion, she couldn't deny the courage, the resilience he had shown. Eventually, he continued. The war ended. The armistice was signed.
Von Reicher des Appaart.
I was released, along with the other prisoners of war. But I couldn't just come home. Not yet. Why not? Catherine asked, her voice sharp. Why let me believe you were dead? He hesitated, his gaze meeting hers, his eyes filled with a complex mix of emotions she couldn't decipher. Because von Richer's network was still active. He had spies everywhere, even in England, even in America. He was looking for something, Catherine. Something he believed I knew. And he wouldn't hesitate to hurt anyone who got in his way. Including me, Catherine realized, a cold dread settling in the pit of her stomach. Especially you, Lucas confirmed. You were my weakness, Catherine. The one person he could use to get to me. I had to protect you. I had to make sure he believed I was dead. His explanation made a terrifying kind of sense. It was a twisted, convoluted logic, born of the paranoia and the ruthlessness of war. But it still didn't excuse the pain he had caused her, the year of grief he had allowed her to endure.
And now?
Catherine asked. Why reveal yourself now? Because I believe I found a way to stop him, Lucas said. I have information, evidence that could expose his network, dismantle his operation. But I need your help. My help? Catherine was taken aback. What could I possibly do? You're going to America, Lucas said.
So ist von Reicher.
He's on this ship, Catherine. He's traveling under an assumed name, but I know it's him. And I believe he's carrying something with him, something that could be incredibly dangerous. I need you to help me find it. The revelation was a bombshell. Von Richer, the ruthless German intelligence officer, was on the Mauretania, a predator lurking among the unsuspecting passengers. And Lucas was asking her to become a spy, to enter a world of deception and danger, a world she had hoped to leave behind forever. Before she could respond, a sudden noise from her cabin startled them both. It was a faint scratching sound, followed by a muffled thud. Lucas's eyes widened. Stay here, he whispered, his hand reaching inside his coat, revealing the glint of a small pistol. He moved swiftly, silently, towards the corridor that led to her cabin. Catherine, her heart pounding, followed him, her instincts as a nurse overriding her fear. He reached the door of her cabin and paused, listening intently. The scratching sound came again, followed by a rustling noise. He turned the knob slowly, cautiously, and pushed the door open. The cabin was dimly lit, the porthole casting a sliver of moonlight across the floor. And then she saw it. A small, intricately carved wooden box lay on the floor, near her overturned suitcase. It hadn't been there before. And coiled around it, its scales shimmering in the moonlight, was a snake. A venomous-looking serpent, its head raised, its forked tongue flickering. A clear threat. Someone had searched her room and left a deadly warning. Chapter 4. Whispers of Chateau Thierry. Catherine gasped, instinctively recoiling. The snake, a vibrant green with black markings, remained coiled around the box, its eyes, like tiny black beads, fixed on them. It was a species she vaguely recognized from a medical textbook of fer de lance, native to South America, its venom potent and fast-acting. Lucas swore under his breath, his hand tightening on the pistol. Don't move, he whispered, his voice tight with urgency. It's highly venomous. He moved slowly, deliberately, placing himself between Catherine and the snake. His eyes never left the creature, assessing its movements, calculating the risk. The air in the cabin was thick with tension, the silence punctuated only by the gentle creak of the ship and the faint hiss of the snake. How did it get in here? Catherine whispered, her voice trembling. Her mind raced, trying to make sense of the situation. The snake was clearly not a native inhabitant of the ship. Someone had deliberately placed it there. Von Richer, Lucas said, his voice grim. It's a message. A warning. The implication was clear. Von Riker knew about Lucas's presence on the ship, knew about his connection to Catherine. The snake was a threat, a demonstration of his reach, his ruthlessness. "We need to get rid of it," Catherine said, her voice regaining some of its composure. Her nurse's training kicked in, overriding her fear. "And we need to find out who put it here." Lucas nodded. He glanced around the cabin, his eyes searching for a weapon, a tool, anything he could use to deal with the snake. He spotted a heavy brass candlestick on the vanity. "I'll distract it," he said. "When I do, grab that fire poker from beside the small coal stove. Be careful and be quick." Catherine nodded, her heart pounding. She had faced down death many times in the field hospitals, but this was different. This was a deliberate, calculated act of malice, a threat aimed directly at her. Lucas moved slowly towards the snake, holding the candlestick in front of him like a shield. He made a sudden, sharp movement, drawing the snake's attention. The creature hissed, its head swaying back and forth, its forked tongue flicking in and out. Catherine seized the opportunity. She grabbed the fire poker, her hand steady despite her racing pulse. She moved quickly, silently, positioning herself behind the snake. Lucas continued to distract the creature, his movements calculated to keep its attention focused on him. He was risking his life to protect her, a selfless act that stirred a complex mix of emotions within her: gratitude, admiration, and a flicker of the love she had thought lost. With a deep breath, Catherine brought the fire poker down on the snake, just behind its head. The creature writhed, its body convulsing, then went still. Lucas let out a sigh of relief, his shoulders slumping. He lowered the candlestick, his hand trembling slightly. "Are you all right?" Catherine asked, her voice filled with concern. He nodded, his eyes meeting hers. "Yes. Thanks to you." The shared danger, the successful execution of their impromptu plan, had created a momentary bond between them, a sense of shared purpose. But the underlying tension, the unanswered questions, remained. They carefully disposed of the snake's body through the porthole, ensuring no trace of it remained. Then, they turned their attention to the wooden box. It was small, about the size of a jewelry box, made of dark, polished wood. It was intricately carved, with scenes of what looked like jungle foliage and strange, exotic animals. It was locked, the latch secured with a small, intricate mechanism. "This is it," Lucas said, his voice low. "This is what Von Riker is carrying. This is what he's willing to kill for." Catherine examined the box, her fingers tracing the intricate carvings. It felt heavy, substantial. What could it contain? Documents? Tools? Something even more dangerous?
"We need to open it," she said.
Lucas nodded. He tried to force the latch, but it wouldn't budge. He examined the mechanism carefully, his brow furrowed in concentration.
"It's a complex lock," he said.
"I need tools. Something small and precise." Catherine remembered the small set of surgical instruments she had packed in her medical kit, a habit from her nursing days. She retrieved the kit, her hands moving with practiced efficiency. She selected a thin, sharp scalpel and a pair of delicate forceps. Lucas took them, his fingers brushing hers, sending a jolt of electricity through her. He worked patiently, carefully, manipulating the lock mechanism with the surgical instruments. The cabin was silent, the only sound the faint click of metal against metal. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, the latch clicked open. Lucas slowly lifted the lid of the box. Inside, nestled on a bed of faded velvet, was a single, rolled-up sheet of paper. It was old, yellowed with age, the edges frayed. It was covered in intricate writing, a series of symbols and characters that Catherine didn't recognize. Lucas carefully unrolled the paper, his eyes scanning the contents. His expression changed, a mixture of shock and recognition dawning on his face. "This is it," he whispered, his voice filled with awe. "This is the Chateau Thierry cipher. It's been lost for months. The one thing Von Riker needed to complete his plans." The whispers about double agents, about the almost supernatural knowledge Von Riker's team possessed, it was all tied to this single document. The weight of it, The potential implications settled heavily in the small cabin. The game had just become far more dangerous. Chapter 5. The Captain's Dinner and the Missing Papers. The discovery of the Chateau Thierry's cipher changed everything. The leisurely voyage across the Atlantic had transformed into a tense, dangerous game of cat and mouse. Lucas explained that the cipher was a complex code used by a specific German intelligence unit during the war, a unit believed to have been disbanded. Its reappearance suggested a far more insidious plot, one that reached beyond the concluded war and into the fragile peace. Von Riker must be planning something, Lucas said, pacing the confines of Catherine's cabin. Something big. This cipher, it could unlock a network of spies, reveal hidden agendas, destabilize governments. Catherine felt a chill run down her spine. The implications were terrifying. The war had ended, but the battles were clearly far from over. "We need to get this to the authorities," she said. "To someone who can decipher it, understand its significance." Lucas nodded. "But we can't trust anyone on this ship. Von Riker has eyes and ears everywhere. We need to be careful, discreet." They decided to keep the cipher hidden, concealed within the lining of Catherine's coat. It was a risky move, but they had no other choice. They were isolated on the vast ocean, surrounded by potential enemies, with no way to know who they could trust. The following evening was the captain's dinner, a formal affair that required the passengers to dress in their finest attire. Catherine dreaded the event, the thought of mingling with strangers, of making polite conversation, while carrying a secret that could have global ramifications. She wore a deep emerald green gown, a dress she had purchased before the war, a relic of a life that felt a lifetime ago. It felt strange, foreign, to be wearing something so elegant, so frivolous, after years of wearing practical, utilitarian clothing. Lucas, surprisingly, looked dashing in a borrowed tuxedo. The formal attire suited him, accentuating his broad shoulders and his lean physique. He looked every bit the dashing officer she had fallen in love with, the man who had haunted her dreams. But the shadows were still there, lurking in the depths of his eyes. The war had changed him, hardened him, made him a stranger in many ways. The captain's dinner was a lavish affair, a display of opulence that felt out of place in the aftermath of war. The dining room was a sea of glittering jewels, shimmering fabrics, and forced smiles. The air was thick with the scent of perfume, cigar smoke, and underlying tension. Catherine and Lucas sat at a table with several other passengers, a mix of nationalities and backgrounds. There was a British diplomat, a wealthy American businessman, a French actress, and a mysterious, silent man who introduced himself only as Mr. Schmidt. Catherine immediately suspected Mr. Schmidt. He had the cold, calculating eyes of a predator, the quiet intensity of a man who is used to getting his way. He watched Lucas with a subtle, almost imperceptible scrutiny that sent shivers down Catherine's spine. The conversation flowed around them, a meaningless stream of polite chatter about the weather, the ship, the post-war world. Catherine struggled to maintain a facade of normalcy, her mind racing, her senses on high alert. Lucas, to his credit, played his part perfectly. He engaged in the conversation, making witty remarks, charming the other passengers. He even managed to dance with Catherine, a slow, graceful waltz that transported her back to a happier time, before the war, before the lies, before the danger. But even as they danced, she could feel the tension in his body, the alertness in his eyes. He was constantly scanning the room, watching for any sign of threat, any indication that they were being observed. During a brief lull in the conversation, Lucas leaned in close to Catherine, his voice barely a whisper. "Schmidt," he murmured. "He's one of them. I'm sure of it." Catherine nodded, her heart pounding. She had felt it too, the sense of danger that emanated from the silent man. "We need to get away from him," she whispered. "We need to find a safe place to talk." They excused themselves from the table, claiming a need for fresh air. They made their way to the upper deck, the cold night air a welcome relief from the stuffy atmosphere of the dining room. As they stood at the railing, looking out at the vast, dark expanse of the ocean, Lucas suddenly stiffened. "The cipher," he whispered, his voice filled with alarm. It's gone. Catherine's blood ran cold. She felt inside her coat, her fingers searching frantically for the rolled-up paper. It wasn't there. The lining of her coat was empty. The cipher had been stolen, and they both knew who had taken it. The seemingly polite, celebratory captain's dinner had been a carefully orchestrated distraction. Their every move had been watched. Chapter 6. A familiar scar in candlelight. Panic flared in Catherine's chest, a cold, constricting band tightening around her lungs. The loss of the cipher was a devastating blow, a setback that could have dire consequences.
How?
She whispered, her voice trembling. How did they get it? Lucas's face was grim, his jaw set in a hard line. I don't know. I was careful. I never let you out of my sight. They retraced their steps, mentally reviewing every moment of the evening, every interaction, every opportunity for someone to have stolen the cipher. The dance, the conversation at the table, the brief moment when Catherine had excused herself to powder her nose, the powder room, Catherine said, her voice rising in realization. I left my coat on a chair for a few minutes.
Someone could have taken it then.
Lucas nodded, his eyes narrowed. It's the only explanation. Schmidt must have had someone watching you, waiting for an opportunity. They hurried back to the powder room, a small, elegantly decorated space off the main corridor. It was empty now, the air still thick with the scent of perfume and face powder. Catherine searched the room frantically, checking under the chairs, behind the curtains, in the waste paper basket. But the cipher was nowhere to be found. It's gone, she said, her voice filled with despair. They have it. Lucas leaned against the wall, his shoulders slumping. He looked defeated, the weight of the situation pressing down on him. We can't give up, Catherine said, her voice firm despite her fear. We have to find it. We have to stop von Riker. She looked at Lucas, her eyes searching his. She saw the exhaustion, the frustration, the flicker of doubt in his eyes. But she also saw something else, something that rekindled her hope. She saw the determination, the resilience, the unwavering commitment to his mission. We'll find it, she said, her voice filled with a newfound conviction. We'll find it together. Lucas met her gaze, a spark of hope rekindling in his eyes. He straightened up, his shoulders squared, his resolve renewed. You're right, he said. We can't give up. We'll start by searching Schmidt's cabin. He's the most likely suspect. It was a risky plan, a dangerous undertaking. But they had no other choice. They were running out of time. They waited until the late hours of the night, when most of the passengers were asleep. The ship was quiet, the only sound the gentle creak of the hull and the distant hum of the engines. They made their way to Schmidt's cabin, their hearts pounding, their senses on high alert. Lucas had managed to obtain a key, a testament to his resourceful nature, his ability to operate in the shadows. He unlocked the door silently, cautiously, and they slipped inside. The cabin was dark, the only light filtering in from the corridor through the partially open door. Lucas produced a small penlight, casting a narrow beam of light around the room. The cabin was small and sparsely furnished, with a single bed, a wardrobe, a desk, and a chair. They began their search, moving systematically, meticulously, checking every drawer, every shelf, every possible hiding place. They found nothing. Catherine was starting to lose hope. Had they been wrong about Schmidt? Was he just a harmless passenger, a victim of their paranoia? Then, Lucas let out a soft gasp. He was standing by the desk, shining his penlight on a small, seemingly insignificant detail. Look, he whispered, pointing to a faint scar on the polished surface of the desk. It was a small, almost imperceptible mark, but it was familiar. Catherine leaned closer, her eyes widening in recognition. It was the same shape, the same size, as the mark left by the clasp of the wooden box that had contained the cipher. The box that had been in her cabin, surrounded by the snake. He had it here, Lucas said, his voice tight with anger. He had the box here, and he removed the cipher. But where was the cipher now? They continued their search, their hope renewed, their determination fueled by the discovery. They searched the wardrobe, the drawers, under the bed, behind the curtains. They found nothing. Then Catherine noticed something. The bedspread, a thick, quilted fabric, was slightly rumpled, uneven. She lifted the edge of the bedspread, and there, tucked between the mattress and the bed frame, she found it. It was a small, leather-bound book, its cover worn and faded. It wasn't a cipher, but it was something. She opened the book carefully, her fingers trembling. The pages were filled with handwritten notes, diagrams, and photographs. One photograph in particular caught her eye. It was a picture of Lucas, taken during the war, in his uniform. But there was something else in the photo, something that made her blood run cold. Standing next to Lucas, his arm around his shoulder, was a man Catherine recognized. A man she had trusted. A man who had been a close friend, and who had supposedly died a hero's death alongside the report of Lucas at Chateau Thierry. The candlelight flickered, casting long shadows, mirroring the dawning horror in Catherine's eyes. The betrayal cut deeper than any wound she had ever treated. Chapter 7. The Weight of Unsent Letters. The photograph was a gut punch, a betrayal that resonated deeper than any physical wound. Dr. Alistair Finch. A man Catherine had worked alongside for years in the field hospitals, a man she had respected, admired, even considered a friend. He had been Lucas's closest confidant, his comrade in arms. And, according to official records, he had died a hero's death at Chateau Thierry, saving the lives of several wounded soldiers. But there he was, standing next to Lucas in the photograph, his arm slung casually over his shoulder, a smug, almost predatory smile on his face. The image was a blatant contradiction of everything Catherine believed, a shattering of trust that left her reeling. "Alistair," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "But he's dead. He died at Chateau Thierry." Lucas took the book from her trembling hands, his eyes scanning the photograph. His face was a mask of shock and disbelief, his jaw clenched tight. He was with us on the mission," Lucas said, his voice strained. "He was captured along with me. We were tortured. Together." He paused, his eyes clouding over with the memory of the horrors they had endured. "I saw him die," Lucas continued, his voice barely a whisper. "I saw him shot by a German guard. I held him in my arms as he breathed his last." But the photograph was undeniable proof that Alistair Finch had not died at Chateau Thierry. He had survived, and somehow he had ended up working with von Riker. "He must have been a double agent," Catherine said, her voice filled with a sickening realization. "All along. He was feeding information to the Germans, betraying us, betraying you." Lucas nodded, his eyes filled with a mixture of anger and pain. The betrayal of a friend, a comrade, cut deeper than any enemy's blow.
But why?
Catherine asked. Why would he do it? What could he possibly gain? Lucas shook his head. "I don't know. Money? Power? Ideology? It doesn't matter. What matters is that he's working with von Riker, and he has the cipher." The weight of the situation pressed down on them, a crushing burden of responsibility and danger. They were facing not only a ruthless enemy in von Riker, but also a traitor, a man who had been one of their own. They continued to examine the leather-bound book, searching for any clues, any information that could help them understand Alistair's motives, his plans. The book contained a series of handwritten notes, coded messages, and diagrams of what looked like military installations and troop movements. It also contained several letters, unsent letters, addressed to a woman named Elise. Catherine began to read the letters, her heart aching with a strange mixture of sadness and morbid curiosity. The letters were filled with expressions of love, of longing, of a desperate desire to be reunited with this Elise. But as she read further, she realized that the letters were not just love letters. They were also filled with information, details about Alistair's work as a double agent, his collaboration with von Riker, his plans for the future. "Listen to this," Catherine said, reading aloud a passage from one of the letters. "My dearest Elise, I have secured the cipher.
Von Riker is pleased.
He promises that once this is over, we will be together, free to live our lives as we please. He has arranged for passage to America, a new identity, a new life. We will be rich, Elise, beyond our wildest dreams. The words were chilling, a testament to Alistair's greed, his ambition, his willingness to betray his country, his friends, for personal gain. "He's on this ship," Lucas said, his voice tight with anger. "He's traveling under an assumed name, just like von Riker. He's planning to start a new life in America, with the money he's earned from his treachery." Catherine closed the book, her hands trembling. The unsent letters were a window into Alistair's soul, a revelation of his true nature, his betrayal, his twisted love for this Elise. "We have to stop him," she said. "We have to find him and get the cipher back." Lucas nodded, his eyes filled with a steely determination. The betrayal had fueled his resolve, strengthened his commitment to his mission. "We will," he said, "and we'll make him pay for what he's done." The weight of unsent letters, filled with deceit and twisted affection, had revealed a truth far more dangerous than they could have imagined. The personal had become inextricably intertwined with the political, and the stakes were higher than ever. Chapter 8. Dancing on the Edge of Forever. The discovery of Alistair's betrayal had cast a long shadow, turning the already perilous journey into a treacherous dance with an unseen enemy. They knew Alistair was on the ship, but they didn't know his assumed identity, his location, or his plans. They were surrounded by potential enemies, with no one they could truly trust. Despite the danger, or perhaps because of it, a strange intimacy began to blossom between Catherine and Lucas. The shared danger, the shared secrets, the shared burden of responsibility drew them closer, forging a bond that transcended the lies and the betrayals of the past. They spent hours poring over Alistair's leather-bound book, searching for clues, trying to decipher the coded messages to understand his plans. They worked together seamlessly, their skills and their instincts complementing each other. Catherine's sharp mind and her attention to detail, honed by years of nursing, proved invaluable in deciphering the intricate codes. Lucas's military training and his experience in intelligence gathering provided a crucial framework for understanding the strategic implications of Alistair's plans. They met in secret, in the quiet corners of the ship, stealing moments together amidst the constant threat of discovery. They spoke in hushed tones, their words guarded, their eyes constantly scanning their surroundings. But in those stolen moments, they also found solace, comfort, and a flicker of the love that had been shattered by the war. They talked about their past, about their dreams, about the future they hoped to build together, a future that seemed increasingly precarious. One evening, they found themselves on the upper deck, leaning against the railing, watching the moon cast a silver path across the vast, dark ocean. The air was cold, but they were oblivious to the chill, wrapped in a shared warmth that defied the surrounding darkness. "Do you ever think about what we would have done?" Catherine asked, her voice soft, her gaze fixed on the shimmering horizon. "If the war hadn't happened? If you hadn't..." She trailed off, unable to say the words, died, disappeared, betrayed. Lucas understood. He reached out and took her hand, his touch sending a jolt of electricity through her. "I think about it all the time," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "I would have come back to you, Catherine. I would have asked you to marry me. We would have had a life together. A simple life, filled with love, with laughter, with children." The image, so vivid, so poignant, brought tears to Catherine's eyes. It was a dream they had shared, a future they had planned, a life that had been stolen from them by the war. "It's not too late," Catherine said, her voice trembling. "We can still have that life, Lucas. If we survive this. If we stop von Riker and Alistair." Lucas squeezed her hand, his eyes filled with a fierce determination. "We will survive this, Catherine. And we will have that life. I promise you." He leaned in and kissed her, a slow, tender kiss that was both a promise and a plea. It was a kiss that transcended the danger, the uncertainty, the fear. It was a kiss that spoke of love, of hope, of a future they were determined to reclaim. The kiss deepened, becoming more passionate, more desperate. They clung to each other, their bodies pressed together, seeking solace in the shared warmth, in the fleeting moment of intimacy. They were dancing on the edge of forever, their love a fragile flame flickering in the darkness, threatened by the storm that raged around them. But in that moment, in that embrace, they were oblivious to the danger, lost in the shared dream of a future they might never have. As the music from a distant gramophone drifted up from one of the lower decks, Lucas pulled back slightly, his eyes searching hers. "Dance with me, Catherine," he whispered. "Just for a few minutes. Let's pretend there's no war, no spies, no danger. Just us." She nodded, tears welling up in her eyes. He took her hand, and they began to sway to the faint, melancholic music, their bodies moving together in a slow, graceful waltz. It was a dance of hope, of defiance, of a love that refused to be extinguished. It was a dance on the edge of forever, a stolen moment of peace in the midst of a storm. The precariousness of their situation only heightened the intensity of their connection, making every touch, every glance, every whispered word even more precious. Chapter 9. The storm below deck. The fragile peace they had found in each other's arms was shattered by the sudden, violent lurch of the ship. A rogue wave, monstrous and unforgiving, slammed against the Mauretania, sending a tremor through its massive frame. The gentle sway of their dance was replaced by a chaotic scramble for balance. "What was that?" Catherine gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Lucas, his instincts honed by years of battle, reacted instantly. He grabbed her arm, pulling her towards the nearest doorway, away from the exposed railing. "Storm's brewing," he said, his voice grim. "We need to get below deck." The storm had arrived with a ferocity that mirrored the turmoil in their lives. The wind howled, whipping the sea into a frenzy. Rain lashed down, blurring the lights of the ship, turning the deck into a treacherous, slippery surface. Passengers, startled from their sleep, stumbled out of their cabins, their faces etched with fear and confusion. The ship creaked and groaned, its massive frame protesting against the relentless assault of the waves. Lucas and Catherine made their way down the narrow staircases, the ship tilting precariously with each surge of the storm. The lower decks were a scene of chaos, with passengers huddled together, their faces pale and drawn. The air was thick with the smell of salt water, vomit, and fear. They searched for a safe place, a refuge from the storm, both the external one raging outside and the internal one brewing within them. They knew that von Riker and Alistair would be using the chaos to their advantage, moving unseen, plotting their next move. They found a small, unoccupied storage room, tucked away near the engine room. It was cramped and damp, the air thick with the smell of oil and metal. But it was relatively safe, a temporary sanctuary from the storm. They huddled together, their bodies pressed close for warmth. The roar of the engines and the relentless pounding of the waves were a constant reminder of the fragility of their situation, the precariousness of their journey. "This is it, isn't it?" Catherine said, her voice barely a whisper above the din of the storm. "This is where they'll make their move." Lucas nodded, his face grim. "They'll be using the storm as cover. They'll be trying to get the cipher to its destination, to whoever they're working with in America." They knew they had to act quickly, decisively. They couldn't wait for the storm to pass. They had to find von Riker and Alistair, and they had to retrieve the cipher. "We need a plan," Catherine said, her voice filled with a steely determination. Her nurse's training, her experience in dealing with crises, kicked in, overriding her fear. Lucas nodded. He reached inside his coat, pulling out Alistair's leather-bound book. He opened it, flipping through the pages, his eyes scanning the coded messages, the diagrams. "There's a mention of a rendezvous point," he said, pointing to a specific passage. "A place on the ship where Alistair was supposed to meet with someone. It's coded, but I think I can decipher it." He worked quickly, his mind racing, his fingers tracing the intricate symbols. Catherine watched him, her admiration for his skill, his intelligence, growing with each passing moment. "I think I've got it," he said, his voice filled with a flicker of excitement. "The rendezvous point is the ship's radio room." The radio room. It was a logical choice. It was the only place on the ship where they could communicate with the outside world, send messages to their contacts in America. "We need to get there," Catherine said. "Before they do." It was a dangerous plan, a reckless undertaking. The radio room was likely to be heavily guarded, and they would be facing not only von Riker and Alistair, but also any other accomplices they might have on board. But they had no other choice. The fate of the cipher, the future of their mission, depended on it. They left the storage room, stepping back into the chaos of the storm-tossed ship. The corridors were a scene of pandemonium, with passengers scrambling for safety, crew members struggling to maintain order. They moved quickly, silently, making their way towards the radio room, their hearts pounding, their senses on high alert. The storm raged around them, a physical manifestation of the internal storm that was about to break. The ship pitched violently, and a wave crashed over the bow, sending a spray of icy water down a nearby stairwell. They were close. Chapter 10. Confessions in the Lifeboat. The radio room was located on the upper deck, near the bridge. As they approached, they could hear the frantic clicking of the telegraph, the crackle of static, the desperate attempts of the radio operator to maintain contact with the outside world amidst the raging storm. Lucas peered through the small, porthole-shaped window in the door. He saw the radio operator, his back to them, hunched over the equipment, his headphones clamped over his ears. He also saw Alistair Finch, standing near the window, his face pale and drawn, his eyes fixed on the stormy sea. He was alone. Von Riker was nowhere to be seen. "He's waiting for someone," Lucas whispered to Catherine. "He's waiting for von Riker." They had to act quickly, before von Riker arrived. They couldn't risk a confrontation with both of them in the confined space of the radio room. Lucas took a deep breath, his hand reaching inside his coat, gripping the small pistol he had concealed there. He nodded to Catherine a silent signal. He pushed open the door, stepping into the radio room, Catherine close behind him. The radio operator, startled by their sudden appearance, turned around, his eyes widening in surprise. Alistair whirled around, his hand instinctively reaching inside his coat. His eyes met Lucas's, and a flicker of recognition, of fear, passed across his face. "Lucas," he gasped.
"But you're dead. I saw you die."
Lucas ignored him, his attention focused on the radio operator. "Get out," he said, his voice cold and commanding.
"Now."
The radio operator, sensing the danger, didn't hesitate. He scrambled out of the room, disappearing down the corridor. Lucas turned his attention back to Alistair, his pistol leveled at his chest. "Where is von Riker?" he demanded. Alistair's face was a mask of conflicting emotions: fear, guilt, defiance. He shook his head. I don't know," he stammered. "I haven't seen him." "Don't lie to me, Alistair," Lucas said, his voice dangerously low. "Where is the cipher?" Alistair hesitated, his eyes darting around the room, as if searching for an escape. But there was nowhere to go. I don't have it," he said. "Von Riker has it. He was supposed to meet me here." Lucas didn't believe him. He knew Alistair was lying, protecting von Riker, protecting himself. The ship lurched violently, throwing them off balance. A rogue wave crashed against the hull, sending a spray of water through the open window. The storm was intensifying, mirroring the escalating tension in the room. Suddenly, the door burst open, and a figure stumbled into the room, soaked to the bone, his face contorted in a mixture of rage and desperation. It was von Riker. He saw Lucas and Catherine, his eyes widening in surprise, then narrowing in fury. He reached inside his coat, pulling out a pistol. "You," he snarled. "You should be dead." The situation had reached a boiling point. 3 figures, armed and dangerous, trapped in a small, storm-tossed room, their fates intertwined. Before anyone could react, a deafening crack echoed through the room. The ship had struck something. A submerged object, a rogue iceberg, ripped a gash in the hull. The Mauretania shuddered violently, listing sharply to one side. Alarms blared, and the sounds of panic and chaos erupted from throughout the ship. "We're sinking," von Riker yelled, his voice filled with terror. "We have to get to the lifeboats." The 3 of them, former allies and now deadly enemies, were forced into an uneasy truce, a temporary alliance against a common enemy, the sinking ship. They scrambled out of the radio room, joining the throngs of passengers desperately trying to reach the lifeboats. The scene was one of pure pandemonium, a chaotic scramble for survival. Lucas, Catherine, Alistair, and Von Riker managed to reach a lifeboat, one of the last remaining ones. They clambered aboard, along with a handful of other passengers, their faces etched with terror. As the lifeboat was lowered, creaking precariously, into the raging sea, Alistair began to speak, his voice barely audible above the roar of the storm. "I never wanted this," he confessed, his eyes filled with tears. "I never wanted to betray you, Lucas. I was forced." Von Riker, he threatened Elise. He threatened to hurt her if I didn't cooperate. His confession, wrung from him by the imminence of death, hung in the air, a stark revelation amidst the chaos. He had betrayed his friends, his country, for love. A twisted, desperate love that had led him down a path of destruction. The lifeboat, a fragile vessel tossed about by the merciless waves, had become a confessional, a stage for the final, desperate act of a tragic play. Chapter 11. The Shadow of Another Woman. Alistair's confession hung in the cold, salty air, a stark counterpoint to the howling wind and crashing waves. The lifeboat, a tiny speck of humanity amidst the vast, churning ocean, pitched and rolled precariously, threatening to capsize at any moment. Catherine stared at Alistair, her mind reeling. Elise. The woman in the unsent letters. The woman he had betrayed everything for. A woman Catherine had envisioned as a victim, a pawn in Von Riker's twisted game. But the reality, as it often did, was far more complex. Forced? Lucas scoffed, his voice laced with bitterness. You had a choice, Alistair. We all have choices. You chose to betray us, to betray your country, for your own selfish desires. Alistair shook his head, tears streaming down his face, mingling with the rain and the sea spray. You don't understand, he pleaded. Von Riker, he had information. About Elise. About her past. Things she didn't want anyone to know. He threatened to expose her, to ruin her life. Catherine felt a flicker of not sympathy, exactly, but perhaps understanding. She had seen the power of secrets, the lengths people would go to protect themselves, to protect the ones they loved. She had kept secrets of her own, hidden wounds that she had never shared with anyone, not even Lucas. What kind of information? Catherine asked, her voice surprisingly calm despite the turmoil within her. She needed to understand, to unravel the tangled web of lies and betrayals that had led them to this desperate point. Alistair hesitated, his eyes darting nervously towards Von Riker, who was huddled in the corner of the lifeboat, his face pale and drawn, his gaze fixed on the stormy sea. He seemed oblivious to their conversation, lost in his own terror. It doesn't matter now, Alistair said, his voice barely a whisper. It's all over. We're going to die. It matters to me, Catherine said, her voice firm. I need to know the truth. Alistair looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of despair and something else. Something that looked like resignation. Elise, she wasn't who she claimed to be, he said, his voice low and strained. She was a German agent. She was working for Von Riker long before I ever met her. She seduced me, manipulated me, used me to get information. The revelation was a shock, a twist that Catherine hadn't anticipated. Elise, the supposed victim, was a perpetrator, a manipulator, a spy. The shadow of another woman, a woman far more dangerous than Catherine had imagined, loomed over their desperate situation. She played you, Lucas said, his voice cold. She used you just like Von Riker used you. Alistair nodded, his head bowed in shame. I know, he whispered. I was a fool. I fell in love with a lie. The irony was bitter, painful. Alistair, a double agent himself, had been betrayed by another double agent, a woman he had loved, a woman who had used him for her own ends. Where is she now? Catherine asked. Is she on the ship? Alistair shook his head. No, he said. She's in America. Waiting for me. Waiting for the cipher. The cipher. The key to Von Riker's plans, the object of their desperate struggle. It was still out there, somewhere, in the hands of a ruthless enemy. Von Riker has it, Alistair said, his gaze shifting towards the German officer. He's carrying it with him. He plans to deliver it to Elise. Catherine looked at von Riker, her eyes filled with a mixture of anger and determination. He was the key to everything. He was the one they had to stop. The lifeboat lurched violently, throwing them against each other. A wave crashed over the side, drenching them in icy water. The storm was showing no signs of abating. They were adrift in a raging sea, surrounded by danger, their fate uncertain. But even in the face of death, Catherine felt a surge of resolve. She wouldn't give up. She wouldn't let von Riker win. She would fight for the future, for the love she had found with Lucas, for the chance to reclaim the life that had been stolen from them. The truth about Elise, a woman shrouded in deception, had only strengthened her resolve. The battle lines were drawn, and the stakes were higher than ever. Chapter 12. The price of his survival. The storm continued its relentless assault, the lifeboat tossed about like a toy in the monstrous waves. The conversation about Elise had died down, replaced by the grim reality of their fight for survival. Each crashing wave, each violent lurch of the boat, brought them closer to the brink. Catherine, despite her fear, found herself studying Lucas. The lines of strain around his eyes, the set of his jaw, the way he constantly scanned the horizon, it all spoke of a burden he carried, a weight far heavier than the storm raging around them. She had assumed his silence about his death was solely due to the mission, to von Riker's threats. But Alistair's confession and the revelation about Elise had cast a new light on his actions. During a brief lull in the storm, when the wind seemed to hold its breath for a moment, Catherine turned to Lucas. "There's more, isn't there?" she asked softly, her voice barely audible above the creaking of the lifeboat and the distant roar of the sea. "More to why you stayed away. Why you let me believe you were dead." Lucas avoided her gaze, his eyes fixed on the churning water. The silence stretched, taut and heavy. Finally, he spoke, his voice low and strained. "After I was captured after the torture, von Riker made me an offer." Catherine's heart clenched. She had a terrible premonition of what was coming. "He knew about you," Lucas continued, his voice barely a whisper. "He knew everything about you. He showed me pictures, letters. He threatened to hurt you, to make you suffer." Unless he paused, his jaw clenching, his knuckles white as he gripped the edge of the lifeboat. "Unless I agreed to work for him," he finished, his voice filled with a mixture of shame and self-loathing. Catherine felt a cold wave of shock wash over her. Lucas, her Lucas, had agreed to work for von Riker? To betray his country, his ideals, everything he believed in? "You became a double agent?" she whispered, her voice trembling. Lucas nodded, his head bowed.
"Not willingly," he said.
"I had no choice. I had to protect you. I had to make sure he didn't hurt you." It was a twisted, horrifying echo of Alistair's confession. Both men had betrayed their countries, their friends, for the sake of a woman. But Lucas's sacrifice, his willingness to sacrifice his own honor, his own soul, to protect her, was a testament to the depth of his love. "But the armistice," Catherine said. "The war ended. Why didn't you come back then?" "Because von Riker still had leverage," Lucas explained. "He still had the cipher. And he still had Elise. He threatened to expose my collaboration, to ruin my reputation, to have me court-martialed, imprisoned, to make sure I could never be with you." Catherine understood now. The price of his survival, the price of his love for her, had been his own freedom, his own honor. He had been trapped in a web of deceit, forced to play a dangerous game, all to protect her.
"So, this whole time on the ship," Catherine began.
"I was trying to find a way out," Lucas finished. "To get the cipher back, to expose von Riker, to clear my name, to be free to be with you." The revelation was a heavy burden, a testament to the enduring power of love and the terrible choices it could force people to make. The storm raged around them, but within the confines of the lifeboat, a different kind of storm had broken, a storm of truth, of confession, of understanding. Catherine reached out and took his hand, her fingers intertwining with his. She didn't care about his past, about his forced collaboration with von Riker. She only cared about the man he was now, the man who had sacrificed everything to protect her. "We'll get through this, Lucas," she said, her voice firm, her eyes filled with a love that transcended the lies, the betrayals, the danger. Together. He squeezed her hand, his eyes meeting hers. A flicker of hope, of gratitude, shone in their depths. The price of his survival had been steep, but perhaps, just perhaps, they could find a way to redeem it, to build a future together, free from the shadows of the past. Chapter 13. A Stolen Kiss Under the Stars. The storm, as if mirroring the emotional turmoil within the lifeboat, began to subside. The wind lessened its furious howl, the waves calmed their frantic dance, and the clouds parted, revealing a sky dusted with a million shimmering stars. The sudden tranquility was almost surreal, a stark contrast to the chaos that had reigned just moments before. The occupants of the lifeboat, exhausted and battered, stared up at the celestial display, their faces illuminated by the soft, ethereal glow. Von Riker, who had remained silent and withdrawn throughout the ordeal, stirred slightly. He looked at Lucas and Catherine, his eyes filled with a mixture of contempt and something else. Something that looked almost like respect. "You love her," he said, his voice raspy and weak. It wasn't a question, but a statement of fact. Lucas didn't answer, but his grip on Catherine's hand tightened, a silent affirmation of his feelings. Von Riker chuckled, a dry, humorless sound. "Love," he scoffed. "A weakness. A liability. It will be your undoing." His words, though laced with cynicism, held a ring of truth. Love had been the driving force behind the betrayals, the sacrifices, the desperate choices that had brought them to this point. It had been Alistair's weakness, and it had almost been Lucas's. But Catherine saw it differently. Love wasn't a weakness. It was a strength. It was the source of their resilience, their determination, their hope. "It's also what will save us," Catherine said, her voice firm, her eyes fixed on von Riker. The German officer didn't respond, his gaze shifting back to the stars. He seemed to have lost his fight, his spirit broken by the storm and the imminent threat of death. The silence returned, broken only by the gentle lapping of the waves against the hull of the lifeboat and the soft creak of the oars as one of the other passengers, a young sailor, began to row, trying to steer them towards a distant, faint light on the horizon, a ship, perhaps, or a sign of land. Lucas leaned closer to Catherine, his breath warm against her ear. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "For everything. For putting you in danger. For letting you believe I was dead." Catherine shook her head. "Don't," she said. "You did what you had to do. To protect me." She turned to him, her eyes searching his. The starlight illuminated his face, revealing the lines of strain, the shadows of the past, but also the unwavering love that shone in his eyes. "I understand now," she said. "And I forgive you." He smiled, a slow, hesitant smile that reached his eyes, crinkling the corners, just like in the photograph, the one she had carried with her for so long, the one that had represented both her greatest love and her greatest loss. He leaned in and kissed her, a gentle, tender kiss that was a stark contrast to the desperate, passionate kiss they had shared on the deck of the Mauretania. This kiss was a promise, a commitment, a declaration of a love that had survived the war, the lies, the betrayals. It was a stolen kiss, a moment of peace snatched from the jaws of danger. It was a kiss under the stars, a testament to the enduring power of hope, of resilience, of the human spirit. As they kissed, Catherine felt a surge of warmth, of love, of determination. They would survive this. They would find a way to overcome the obstacles, to defeat their enemies, to build a future together. The distant light on the horizon grew slightly brighter, a beacon of hope in the vast, dark ocean. The sailor continued to row, his movements steady and determined. They were not alone. They had each other, and they had a future to fight for. A future that, for the first time in a long time, seemed within reach. Chapter 14. Betrayal at Dawn. The distant light grew steadily larger, resolving itself into the silhouette of a ship, a freighter by the looks of it, its lights cutting through the pre-dawn gloom. Hope surged through the weary occupants of the lifeboat, a tangible wave of relief washing over them. The sailor redoubled his efforts, rowing with renewed vigor, his muscles straining against the still, choppy sea. Catherine and Lucas held each other close, their bodies intertwined, their hearts filled with a mixture of gratitude and trepidation. They had survived the storm, but their ordeal was far from over. As they drew closer to the freighter, they could make out figures on the deck, waving their arms, shouting encouragement. A rope ladder was lowered, and one by one, the occupants of the lifeboat began to climb aboard, their movements slow and clumsy, their bodies exhausted and battered. Catherine and Lucas were among the last to leave the lifeboat, their reluctance to separate from each other a palpable force. Lucas insisted Catherine go first, his hand steadying her as she climbed the swaying ladder. As Catherine reached the deck of the freighter, she was greeted by a pair of strong arms, helping her over the railing. She turned to thank her rescuer, and her blood ran cold. Standing before her, a smug smile on his face, was Alistair Finch. "Welcome aboard, Catherine," he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "I see you survived the storm." Catherine stared at him, her mind reeling. How was this possible? He had been in a lifeboat with them. He had confessed his betrayal, his love for Elise, his role in Von Riker's plot. But you or she stammered, unable to comprehend the situation. Alistair chuckled, a cold, mirthless sound. "Did you really believe my little sob story?" he said. "My supposed love for Elise? My forced collaboration with Von Riker?" He shook his head, his smile widening. "It was all an act, Catherine. A performance. To gain your trust, to lower your guard." Catherine realized the horrifying truth. Alistair's confession in the lifeboat had been a calculated deception, a ploy to manipulate them, to mislead them. He had never been a victim. He had always been a perpetrator, a willing participant in Von Riker's scheme. "But the photograph," Catherine said, her voice trembling. "You and Lucas in the war a clever forgery," Alistair said, his eyes gleaming with triumph. "Von Riker has his resources. He can create any illusion he desires." Lucas, who had just reached the deck, froze, his eyes widening in disbelief as he saw Alistair, as he heard his words. The betrayal cut deeper than ever, a final, devastating blow. "You bastard," Lucas growled, his fists clenching. Alistair ignored him, his attention focused on Catherine. "You see, Catherine," he said, his voice smooth and persuasive, "Von Riker and I have been working together for a long time. Long before the war. We have a common goal, a shared vision for the future. And you, my dear, have been a valuable asset." He reached into his coat, pulling out a small, familiar object. The wooden box. The box that had contained the Chateau Thierry cipher. "The cipher," Catherine whispered, her heart sinking. Alistair nodded. "It's been with me all along," he said, safely tucked away, waiting for the right moment. He opened the box, revealing the rolled-up sheet of paper, the intricate code that held the key to Von Riker's plans. "And now," Alistair said, his smile turning predatory, "it's time to deliver it to its rightful owner." He turned and walked towards the bridge of the freighter, leaving Catherine and Lucas standing on the deck, their hope shattered, their trust betrayed, their future uncertain. The dawn broke, painting the sky in hues of pink and orange, but for them, it was a dawn of despair, a dawn of betrayal. The freighter, their supposed salvation, had become a trap, and they were caught in the clutches of their enemies. Chapter 15. The truth hidden in his eyes. As Alistair disappeared towards the bridge, Catherine felt a wave of despair wash over her. They had been so close to escaping, to finding safety, to reclaiming their future. But now, they were trapped, their enemies in control, the cipher about to be delivered. Lucas stood beside her, his body rigid with anger, his fists clenched, so tight his knuckles were white. He looked defeated, the weight of Alistair's final betrayal crushing him. "We have to stop him," Catherine said, her voice barely a whisper, but filled with a steely determination. She wouldn't give up. She wouldn't let Alistair win. Lucas shook his head. It's too late, he said, his voice hollow. He has the cipher. He has the ship. We're at his mercy. Catherine refused to accept defeat. She looked at Lucas, her eyes searching his. She saw the despair, the exhaustion, the flicker of doubt in his eyes. But she also saw something else. Something that rekindled her hope. She saw the intelligence, the resilience, the unwavering love that had sustained them through so much. And she saw a flicker of something else. Something she couldn't quite decipher. A hidden depth, a secret he was still keeping. There's something you're not telling me, Lucas, she said, her voice firm, her gaze unwavering. Something about Alistair. Something about the cipher. Lucas avoided her gaze, his eyes shifting nervously around the deck. The silence stretched, taut and heavy. Finally, he spoke, his voice low and strained. There's a reason Alistair chose this particular freighter, he said. It's not a coincidence. Catherine frowned. What do you mean? Lucas took a deep breath, his eyes meeting hers. The freighter is owned by a shell company, he explained. A company controlled by my family. Catherine stared at him, her mind reeling. Lucas's family? Involved in this? My uncle, Lucas continued, his voice filled with a mixture of shame and resignation. He's been working with von Riker for years. He's the one who arranged for the freighter, for the rendezvous. He's the one Alistair is going to deliver the cipher to. The revelation was a shock, a twist that Catherine hadn't anticipated. The betrayal ran deeper than she had imagined, reaching into Lucas's own family, his own past.
But why?
Catherine asked. Why would your uncle do this? Lucas shook his head.
Money, he said. Power.
He's always been ambitious, ruthless. He sees this as an opportunity to expand his influence, to gain control. The truth was a bitter pill to swallow. Lucas had been betrayed not only by a friend, but by his own family, his own blood. We have to stop them, Catherine said, her voice filled with a renewed sense of urgency. We have to stop your uncle, and we have to get the cipher back. Lucas nodded, his eyes hardening with determination. The revelation about his uncle had fueled his resolve, strengthened his commitment to his mission.
There's a way, he said. A secret passage.
It leads from the engine room to the captain's cabin. My uncle always uses it when he's on board. It's how he conducts his business, discreetly. It was a risky plan, a desperate gamble. But it was their only hope. Let's go, Catherine said, her voice firm. They moved quickly, silently, making their way towards the engine room, their hearts pounding, their senses on high alert. The truth, hidden in Lucas's eyes for so long, had been revealed, and it had changed everything. The battle lines were redrawn, the stakes higher than ever. They were not only fighting von Riker and Alistair, but also Lucas's own family, a betrayal that cut to the core of his being. But it also offered a glimmer of hope, a chance to use his family's secrets against them. Chapter 16. The Pursuer Revealed. The engine room was a deafening cacophony of roaring machinery, clanging metal, and hissing steam. The air was thick with the smell of oil and grease, the heat oppressive. It was a chaotic, disorienting environment, the perfect place for a secret passage to be hidden. Lucas led Catherine through the maze of pipes, turbines, and boilers, his movement sure and confident. He knew the ship, knew its secrets, knew the hidden pathways that his uncle used to conduct his clandestine affairs. They found the entrance to the secret passage concealed behind a large, rusted panel near the main engine. It was a narrow, dark opening, barely large enough for a person to squeeze through. Stay close to me, Lucas whispered, his voice barely audible above the din of the engine room. It's a tight fit, and it's easy to get lost. He slipped into the passage, Catherine following close behind. The darkness was almost complete, the only light filtering in from the narrow opening they had just entered. The air was stale and musty, the silence a stark contrast to the noise of the engine room. They moved slowly, cautiously, their hands brushing against the cold, damp walls of the passage. It was a claustrophobic, unsettling experience, the darkness pressing in on them, amplifying their fears. As they progressed deeper into the passage, they could hear faint voices, muffled by the thick walls. They were approaching the captain's cabin, the place where Alistair was likely to be meeting with Lucas's uncle. Lucas stopped, pressing his ear against the wall. He could hear Alistair's voice and another, deeper voice that he recognized as his uncle's. "The cipher is secure," Alistair was saying. "I have it here." "Excellent," Lucas's uncle responded, his voice smooth and cultured, betraying no hint of his treachery. "Von Riker will be pleased. This will change everything." "And what about the woman?" Alistair asked. "And Lucas?" "They're still alive. They're of no consequence," Lucas's uncle said dismissively. "They'll be dealt with discreetly." Catherine felt a chill run down her spine. They were in grave danger. They had to act quickly before it was too late. Lucas motioned for Catherine to stay put. He took a deep breath, his hand reaching inside his coat, gripping the small pistol he had concealed there. He was about to confront his uncle, the man who had betrayed his country, his family, everything he held dear. He pushed open a small, concealed door at the end of the passage, stepping into the captain's cabin. Catherine followed close behind him, her heart pounding. The cabin was lavishly furnished, with rich mahogany paneling, plush velvet seating, and a large, ornate desk. Alistair and Lucas's uncle were standing near the desk, their backs to the door. "Uncle," Lucas said, his voice cold and hard. His uncle turned around, his eyes widening in surprise, then narrowing in anger. He was a tall, imposing man, with silver hair and piercing blue eyes, the same eyes as Lucas, but filled with a cold, calculating ruthlessness. "Lucas," he said, his voice smooth and controlled, betraying no hint of surprise or fear. "I should have known you'd survive. You always were a stubborn one. Where is the cipher?" Lucas demanded, his pistol leveled at his uncle. His uncle smiled, a cold, mirthless smile. "You think you can stop me, Lucas?" he said. "You're outnumbered, outgunned. You have no chance." Suddenly, a figure emerged from behind a curtain, a figure that Catherine recognized instantly. It was Von Riker. He had been on the freighter all along, hidden, waiting for the opportune moment. "He's right, you know," Von Riker said, his voice smooth and menacing. He held a pistol in his hand, aimed directly at Catherine. "It's over." The pursuer had been revealed, and the tables had turned. They were trapped, surrounded by their enemies, the cipher about to fall into the wrong hands. The situation seemed hopeless. But one look passed between Catherine and Lucas. Chapter 17. An impossible choice. The standoff in the captain's cabin was a tableau of tension and desperation. Lucas faced his uncle, his pistol unwavering. Von Riker held Catherine at gunpoint, his cold eyes promising a swift and brutal end. Alistair stood beside Lucas's uncle, a smirk playing on his lips, the wooden box containing the cipher clutched in his hand. "Drop your weapon, Lucas," Von Riker commanded, his voice sharp and devoid of any empathy. "Or the woman dies." Lucas hesitated, his eyes darting between Catherine and his uncle. He was trapped in an impossible dilemma. If he surrendered, they would lose the cipher, and their mission would fail. But if he resisted, Catherine would be killed. Catherine saw the conflict in his eyes, the agonizing choice he was facing. She knew what he was thinking, what he was feeling. She knew that he would sacrifice everything to save her, even his own life, even his own honor. "Don't do it, Lucas," she said, her voice firm, her eyes locked on his. "Don't give them the cipher. It's more important than my life." Her words were a brave sacrifice, a selfless act of love. But Lucas couldn't accept it. He couldn't let her die. He began, his voice trembling, his grip on the pistol loosening. "Don't listen to her, Lucas," his uncle said, his voice smooth and persuasive. "She's just trying to manipulate you. She's a spy, just like you. She doesn't care about you. She only cares about the mission." Lucas's uncle's words were a cruel twist of the knife, a deliberate attempt to undermine his resolve, to break his spirit. "He's lying, Lucas," Catherine said, her voice desperate. "Don't believe him." "Enough talk," von Riker said, his patience wearing thin. "Drop the weapon or I shoot." The moment hung heavy, pregnant with the imminent threat of violence. The fate of the cipher, the fate of their mission, the fate of their lives hung in the balance. Suddenly, Catherine made a move. With a swift, unexpected motion, she elbowed von Riker in the ribs, throwing him off balance. The pistol discharged, the bullet whizzing past her head, embedding itself in the wall. Lucas reacted instantly. He fired his pistol, the bullet striking his uncle in the shoulder. His uncle cried out in pain, dropping to his knees. Alistair, startled by the sudden turn of events, fumbled with the wooden box, dropping it to the floor. The box opened, and the rolled-up sheet of paper, the Chateau Thierry cipher, spilled out. The room erupted in chaos. Lucas and von Riker exchanged fire, the bullets flying, the air filled with the acrid smell of gunpowder. Catherine scrambled for the cipher, her hands reaching for the precious document. Alistair, seeing his opportunity, lunged for the cipher, his fingers brushing against the paper. Catherine tackled him, knocking him to the ground. They struggled fiercely, their bodies grappling, their hands fighting for control of the cipher. Lucas, seeing Catherine in danger, fired another shot, hitting von Riker in the leg. The German officer collapsed, his pistol clattering to the floor. Catherine, with a final surge of strength, managed to wrest the cipher from Alistair's grasp. She clutched it tightly in her hand, her heart pounding, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Lucas stood over his wounded uncle and the injured von Riker, his pistol still trained on them. The immediate threat was neutralized, but the situation was far from resolved. The impossible choice had been averted, not by surrender, but by a desperate act of courage and a swift, decisive response. But the cost had been high. Blood had been spilled, and the future remained uncertain. The cabin was a scene of carnage, a testament to the brutal struggle for power, for control, for the fate of the cipher. Catherine looked at the document in her hand, then at the chaos around, knowing the fight was far from over. Chapter 18. Running from the Past. The aftermath of the confrontation in the captain's cabin was a chaotic scramble. The freighter's crew, alerted by the gunshots, rushed to the scene, their faces a mixture of confusion and alarm. Lucas, with Catherine's help, managed to convince them that his uncle, von Riker, and Alistair were dangerous criminals, international spies who had hijacked the ship. His story was partially true, and aided by the visible wounds of his uncle and von Riker, plus his own commanding presence, the crew, albeit hesitantly, agreed to confine the three men to the brig. Catherine, drawing on her nursing experience, tended to the wounded, her hands steady despite the lingering adrenaline. With the immediate threat contained, Lucas and Catherine found themselves facing a new dilemma. They had the cipher, but they were stranded on a freighter controlled by Lucas's uncle's shell company, heading towards an unknown destination, likely somewhere in America. They couldn't trust the crew, who were probably loyal to his uncle, and they had no way to contact the authorities. "We need to get off this ship," Catherine said, her voice low and urgent. They were standing on the deck, the cool night air a welcome relief from the stuffy confines of the cabin. Lucas nodded. "I know," he said. "But how?" "We're in the middle of the ocean." They scanned the horizon, searching for any sign of land, any indication of their location. But there was nothing, only the vast, dark expanse of the sea. "There's a small port," Lucas said, his voice thoughtful. "A private dock, used by my uncle for his less savory business. It's on a small island, off the coast of Maine. We're probably a few hours away." It was a risky proposition. The island was likely to be guarded, and they would be walking into a potential trap. But they had no other choice. They couldn't stay on the freighter, and they couldn't risk the cipher falling back into the wrong hands. "We'll take a lifeboat," Lucas said. "We'll slip away unnoticed during the night." It was a dangerous plan, a desperate gamble. But they were running out of options. They waited until the late hours of the night, when most of the crew were asleep. The ship was quiet, the only sound the gentle hum of the engines and the rhythmic slosh of the waves against the hull. They gathered some supplies: food, water, blankets, a first aid kit, and made their way to the lifeboat deck. They chose a small, inconspicuous lifeboat, one that was less likely to be noticed. They lowered the lifeboat silently, cautiously, into the dark water. They climbed aboard, their hearts pounding, their senses on high alert. Lucas started the small engine, and the lifeboat sputtered to life, its quiet hum a stark contrast to the silence of the night. They steered away from the freighter, disappearing into the darkness, leaving behind the ship, the betrayals, the past. As they moved further and further away from the freighter, Catherine felt a sense of not exactly relief, but perhaps release. They were running from the past, from the shadows that had haunted them, from the enemies that had pursued them. But they were also running towards an uncertain future. They were alone, adrift on a small lifeboat, heading towards an unknown destination, with no guarantee of safety, no assurance of success. "What will we do when we reach the island?" Catherine asked, her voice barely a whisper above the hum of the engine. Lucas looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of determination and something else. Something that looked like hope.
"We'll find a way," he said.
"We'll find a way to get the cipher to the authorities. We'll expose my uncle, von Riker, Alistair. We'll make them pay for what they've done." And then, he added, his voice softer, "And we'll start a new life, Catherine. Together. A life free from the shadows of the past." His words were a promise, a commitment, a declaration of a love that had survived the war, the lies, the betrayals. It was a dream they had shared, a future they had planned, a life that had been stolen from them, but that they were now determined to reclaim. They were running from the past, but they were also running towards a future they would build together. Chapter 19. The Shores of Deception. The journey to the island was a tense, silent affair. The small lifeboat chugged through the dark water, the only sound the gentle hum of the engine and the rhythmic splash of the waves. The pre-dawn sky was a canvas of deep blues and purples, the stars slowly fading as the promise of a new day approached. Catherine and Lucas huddled together, their bodies close for warmth, their minds racing, their senses on high alert. They knew that the island was likely to be guarded, that they would be facing danger, possibly even a confrontation with Lucas's uncle's men. As the first rays of sunlight painted the horizon, they spotted the island, a small, rocky outcrop rising from the sea. It was shrouded in mist, giving it an eerie, almost ethereal appearance. Lucas steered the lifeboat towards a small, secluded cove, hidden from the main dock. He cut the engine, and the silence descended, broken only by the gentle lapping of the waves against the shore. They disembarked, their feet sinking into the wet sand. They pulled the lifeboat further up the beach, concealing it among the rocks. "Stay close to me," Lucas whispered, his hand reaching for the small pistol he had managed to keep hidden. "And be quiet." They moved cautiously, silently, making their way through the dense undergrowth that covered the island. The air was thick with the scent of salt and pine, the silence broken only by the occasional cry of a seagull. They reached the edge of a clearing, and they saw it a large, imposing house, built in the style of a grand manor, its windows dark and forbidding. It was clearly Lucas's uncle's private retreat, the place where he conducted his clandestine business. "That's it," Lucas whispered. "That's where he'll be." They observed the house from a distance, watching for any sign of activity, any indication of guards. They saw a few figures moving around the grounds, but they couldn't tell if they were armed. "We need a plan," Catherine said, her voice low and urgent. "We can't just walk in there. We'll be outnumbered, outgunned." Lucas nodded. "I know," he said. "But we have to get inside. We have to find out what he's planning, where he's going to deliver the cipher." He thought for a moment, his mind racing, his eyes scanning the surroundings. "There's a service entrance," he said, "at the back of the house. It's usually unguarded. We can try to sneak in that way." It was a risky plan, a desperate gamble. But they had no other choice. They waited until nightfall, using the cover of darkness to their advantage. They moved silently, stealthily, making their way towards the back of the house, their hearts pounding, their senses on high alert. They found the service entrance, a small, nondescript door, hidden in the shadows. Lucas tried the handle, and, to their surprise, it was unlocked. They slipped inside, entering a dark, narrow corridor. They could hear faint voices, muffled by the thick walls. They were inside the house, but they were far from safe. They moved cautiously, silently, their ears straining to catch any sound, any indication of their enemy's location. They found themselves in a large, dimly lit kitchen. It was empty, but the remnants of a recent meal were still on the table, suggesting that someone had been there recently. Suddenly, they heard footsteps approaching. They quickly ducked behind a large pantry, hiding in the shadows. Two men entered the kitchen, their voices low and urgent. Catherine recognized one of them as one of the crew members from the freighter. The other man was a stranger, tall and thin, with a sharp, hawkish face. "The shipment is ready," the crew member was saying. "It will be delivered tonight."
"Good," the stranger said. "Von Reicher ist impatient."
He wants the cipher delivered as soon as possible. Catherine and Lucas exchanged a look. They had to act quickly. They had to stop the shipment, prevent the cipher from reaching its destination. But they also had to consider their own safety, their own survival. The shores of deception, where they had hoped to find refuge, had become another battleground, another test of their courage and their resolve. Chapter 20. New York Reckoning. Lucas and Catherine knew they couldn't stay hidden in the pantry forever. They had to act, and they had to act fast. As the two men continued their conversation, oblivious to their presence, Lucas made a decision. He whispered to Catherine, "Stay here. I'll try to distract them." Before Catherine could protest, Lucas stepped out of the pantry, his pistol drawn. The two men whirled around, startled by his sudden appearance. "Don't move," Lucas commanded, his voice hard and steady. The crew member, recognizing Lucas, went pale. The stranger, however, merely raised an eyebrow, a smirk playing on his lips. Well, the stranger said, his voice smooth and laced with sarcasm. "Look what the cat dragged in. Lucas, isn't it? Your uncle will be so pleased to see you." "Where is he?" Lucas demanded, ignoring the taunt. "And where is the cipher being taken?" The stranger chuckled. "I'm afraid that's none of your concern," he said. "But I can assure you, it's in safe hands. And it will be delivered to its rightful owner very soon." "It's going to New York," Catherine said, stepping out of the pantry, her voice clear and strong. She had pieced together the fragments of information, the whispers, the coded messages. It all pointed to New York City, a bustling metropolis where von Richer's network could operate with ease. The stranger turned to her, his eyes narrowing.
"Clever girl," he said.
"But it won't do you any good. You'll never stop us." Suddenly, a commotion erupted from outside the house. Shouts, gunshots, the sounds of a struggle. "What's going on?" the crew member exclaimed, his voice filled with alarm. The stranger's smirk vanished, replaced by a look of concern.
"It seems your uncle's men have arrived," he said.
"And they're not happy." Lucas seized the opportunity. He lunged at the stranger, knocking him to the ground. The crew member, caught off guard, hesitated for a moment, then drew his own pistol. Catherine, acting on instinct, grabbed a heavy iron skillet from the stove and swung it at the crew member's head. The skillet connected with a sickening thud, and the man crumpled to the floor, unconscious. Lucas wrestled with the stranger, struggling for control of his gun. The two men grappled fiercely, their bodies rolling across the kitchen floor. Catherine, seeing Lucas in danger, grabbed the stranger's pistol from the floor and pointed it at him.
"Stop,"
she commanded, "or I'll shoot." The stranger froze, his eyes meeting Catherine's. He saw the determination in her gaze, the unwavering resolve. He knew she wouldn't hesitate. Lucas, taking advantage of the distraction, managed to overpower the stranger, disarming him and pinning him to the ground. The sounds of fighting outside continued, the battle raging between Lucas's uncle's men and someone else. Who had arrived? Allies? Enemies? It was impossible to tell. Lucas and Catherine quickly bound and gagged the stranger and the unconscious crew member. They had to get out of the house, find out what was happening outside, and somehow get the cipher to safety. They cautiously made their way to the front door, their pistols drawn. They peered outside and they saw a scene of chaos. Lucas's uncle's men were engaged in a fierce gun battle with a group of men in dark suits. The men in suits were clearly professionals, well-armed and well-trained. And they were gaining the upper hand. As Catherine and Lucas watched, one of the men in suits approached the house, his pistol drawn. He saw them, and his eyes widened in recognition. "Mr. Beckett?" he said, his voice filled with surprise. "We've been looking for you." "Who are you?" Lucas demanded. "We're with the U.S. government," the man said. "We've been tracking Von Riker's network for months. We received a tip that he was planning to acquire a certain artifact, the Chateau Thierry cipher." The revelation was a relief, a turning point. They had found allies, people they could trust. The government was involved, and they were no longer alone. The battle outside ended swiftly. Lucas's uncle's men were either killed or captured. The cipher, which Lucas had secured, was handed over to the government agents. As the dust settled, Lucas and Catherine stood on the steps of the Grand Manor, the first light of dawn painting the sky in hues of pink and gold. They had survived. They had succeeded in their mission. The cipher was safe, and Von Riker's network was about to be dismantled. But the final reckoning, the closure to the many open wounds, had only begun. It was time to deal with Alistair, his uncle, and, ultimately, Elise. It was time to head to New York. Epilogue. The New York skyline, a jagged silhouette against the morning sky, greeted them as the government launch sped across the harbor. The city, a symbol of new beginnings, of hope and opportunity, felt both familiar and foreign to Catherine. She had left behind a world of war, of shadows, of betrayals, but the scars remained, etched deep within her soul. Lucas stood beside her, his hand resting on her shoulder, a silent reassurance of his presence, his love, his unwavering support. They had been through so much together, faced so many dangers, overcome so many obstacles. Their bond, forged in the crucible of war and tested by the fires of betrayal, was stronger than ever. The launch docked at a discreet pier, far from the bustling crowds of the city. They were met by a group of government agents, led by the man who had identified himself as Agent Miller, the one who had rescued them on the island. "Mr. Beckett, Ms. Montgomery," Agent Miller said, his voice formal but respectful. "We're grateful for your assistance. The cipher is secure, and we've already begun dismantling Von Riker's network. Your uncle and Alistair Finch are in custody, awaiting trial." "And Von Riker?" Lucas asked. "He succumbed to his injuries," Agent Miller said. "He died en route to a hospital." A sense of not exactly satisfaction, but perhaps closure, washed over Catherine. Von Riker, the ruthless mastermind behind so much pain and suffering, was gone. But the scars he had left, the lives he had shattered, would remain. "There's one more thing," Agent Miller said, his gaze shifting to Catherine. "We believe we've located Elise. She's been living under an assumed name in a quiet neighborhood in Brooklyn. We have her under surveillance." Elise. The woman who had been at the heart of so much deception, so much betrayal. The woman Alistair had loved, the woman who had manipulated him, used him for her own ends. Catherine felt a mixture of emotions: anger, curiosity, and a strange sense of pity. She wanted to see her, to confront her, to understand the forces that had driven her to such treachery. "I want to see her," Catherine said, her voice firm. Agent Miller hesitated, then nodded. "We can arrange that," he said. "But be careful. She's dangerous." Lucas squeezed her shoulder, his eyes filled with concern. "I'll be with you," he said. They were driven to a quiet, tree-lined street in Brooklyn, a world away from the bustling city center. They stopped in front of a small, unassuming house with a neatly trimmed lawn and a flower garden bursting with color. It was a picture of domestic tranquility, a stark contrast to the darkness that lurked within. Agent Miller pointed to the house. "She's inside," he said. "We'll be watching from a distance. Be careful." Catherine and Lucas approached the house, their hearts pounding. Lucas knocked on the door, and after a moment it opened. A woman stood in the doorway, her eyes widening in surprise as she saw them. She was beautiful, with long, dark hair and striking blue eyes. But her beauty was marred by a hardness, a coldness that sent a chill down Catherine's spine. "Elise?" Catherine said, her voice trembling slightly. The woman nodded, her expression unreadable. "My name is Catherine Montgomery," Catherine continued. "And this is Lucas Beckett.
We need to talk to you."
Elise hesitated, then stepped aside, inviting them into the house. The interior was simple but elegant, furnished with taste and refinement. It was a world away from the battlefields, the trenches, the storm-tossed ships that had been the backdrop of their lives for so long. They sat in the living room, facing each other, the silence heavy with unspoken accusations, unacknowledged fears. "Alistair is in custody," Catherine said, her voice steady. "He told us everything. About your collaboration with von Riker. About your plans." Elise's expression didn't change. She remained silent, her gaze fixed on Catherine, her eyes filled with a mixture of defiance and something else. Something that looked almost like sadness.
"Why?"
Catherine asked, her voice filled with a mixture of anger and confusion. "Why did you do it? Why did you betray him? Why did you betray us?" Elise finally spoke, her voice low and husky. "I did what I had to do," she said, "to survive, to protect myself. But you used him," Catherine said. "You manipulated him. You broke his heart." Elise looked away, her gaze drifting towards a framed photograph on the mantelpiece. It was a picture of her and Alistair, taken before the war, their faces young and carefree, their eyes filled with love. "I loved him," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "In my own way. But I had no choice. I was trapped. Von Riker, he had something on me. Something from my past. He threatened to expose me, to ruin my life." It was a familiar story, a twisted echo of Alistair's confession, of Lucas's forced collaboration. The past, with its secrets and its shadows, had a long reach, a powerful grip on their lives. Catherine felt a flicker of not forgiveness, exactly, but perhaps understanding. She had seen the power of secrets, the lengths people would go to protect themselves, to protect the ones they loved. She had kept secrets of her own, hidden wounds that she had never shared with anyone, not even Lucas. "It's over now," Catherine said, her voice softer. "Von Riker is dead. Alistair is in custody. You're free." Elise looked at her, her eyes filled with a mixture of relief and uncertainty. The future stretched before her, a blank canvas, a new beginning. But the scars of the past would remain, a constant reminder of the choices she had made, the betrayals she had committed. Catherine and Lucas left the house, leaving Elise to face her future, to grapple with the consequences of her actions. They walked hand in hand, their steps slow and deliberate, their hearts heavy with the weight of the past, but also filled with a fragile hope for the future. They had survived. They had overcome the obstacles, defeated their enemies, reclaimed their lives. They had found love, forgiveness, and a second chance. As they reached the street, Lucas stopped and turned to Catherine, his eyes filled with a love that transcended the war, the lies, the betrayals. "We did it, Catherine," he said, his voice filled with emotion. "We're free." He leaned in and kissed her, a slow, tender kiss that was a promise, a commitment, a declaration of a love that had endured the darkness and emerged into the light. It was a kiss that sealed their future, a future they would build together, a future free from the shadows of the past, a future filled with hope, with love, with the promise of a new beginning. They had run from their pasts and toward one another, finding a haven of peace in a world still reeling from the wounds of war. Their journey had been arduous, but their destination, hand in hand, was finally in sight. The end.